The rancher went hunting, but captured an Apache woman who changed his fate forever. John McAllister had always been a man of the land. From the moment he could walk, he had learned to ride horses, mend fences, and live in the harsh stretches of the Arizona desert. His ranch was small but well kept, nestled between rocky hills and sparse forests, where the wind carried the scent of sagebrush, and the sun painted the earth in shades of gold and brown. Though the ranch provided food and shelter, it could not fill the emptiness he sometimes felt in his chest. John had spent years alone, raising cattle and tending to his fields, and while he loved the quiet, there were nights when the loneliness felt sharp, like the cold bite of winter air. It was early autumn when John decided to go hunting. The chill in the morning reminded him that winter was coming fast, and food for the ranch needed to be secured. Deer tracks had appeared near the creek, and rabbits and wild turkeys were plentiful in the nearby hills. John packed his rifle, a few tools, and some dried meat, and saddled his old, steady horse, Dusty. The horse had been with him for years, faithful and patient, and John trusted him like a brother. The desert had its own rhythm, one that John understood deeply. He knew which rocks hid snakes, which plants were safe to touch, and where water could be found even in the driest months. He loved the solitude, the way the sun rose and set without anyone to hurry or disturb it. Yet, on this particular morning, something felt different. The wind seemed to whisper along the canyon walls, and the silence carried a weight that made John's senses sharper. He noticed footprints in the soft earth near the creek, small and careful, moving in a pattern unlike any animal he had ever tracked. They were human footprints. John paused, squinting at the ground, trying to decide if he should follow them. For a moment, he considered turning back. Encounters with strangers could be dangerous, especially in these lands where misunderstandings often led to violence. But curiosity gnawed at him. He wanted to see who was moving through his desert, who dared cross his land. He mounted Dusty and followed the tracks cautiously, staying low in the brush and keeping his rifle ready. As he rode deeper into the hills, the tracks became more distinct, and soon he saw smoke curling in the distance. He slowed, unsure what to do. Smoke in the desert often meant a traveler or perhaps a camp of people resting for the night. John knew he should approach carefully, but he was also eager to explore, to see the world beyond his ranch, even if just for a moment. That night, John set up his own small camp near a shallow ravine. He lit a fire and laid out some dried meat, thinking about the tracks and smoke he had seen. The desert night was quiet but alive. Crickets sang, the wind rustled through the sparse trees, and the stars above were brighter than any light in the town. John felt a mix of excitement and unease. There was a tension in the air, something that made him feel both alive and cautious. He checked his traps, the small snares he had placed along a narrow path. They were simple but effective, designed for rabbits or small deer. Sleep came slowly that night. John lay on his bedroll, listening to the sounds of the desert, imagining what he might find in the morning. He thought about the person who had left the tracks, wondering who they were and why they were here. The night was cold, but it was peaceful in a way that only the desert could be. John had faced storms, wild animals, and harsh winters, but he had never felt fear like this. A quiet, tense anticipation that made every sound feel louder. Morning came with a soft, golden light. Dusty stirred beside him, ears twitching at the slightest movement. John rose quietly and checked his traps. That was when he saw it. One of the snares had been triggered not by an animal, but by something far more surprising. In the trap was a young woman, struggling but careful not to injure herself. She had dark hair braided simply, eyes sharp and cautious, and her clothes were made of soft, durable material that looked unlike anything John had seen in the settler towns. She was clearly strong and resourceful, moving with a careful grace even in captivity. John felt a shock of surprise and uncertainty. He had expected deer or rabbits, maybe even a coyote, but not a human being. The woman looked at him steadily, without fear but with clear defiance. John noticed immediately that she was not just another traveler. There was intelligence in her eyes, a calm strength that spoke of someone used to surviving in harsh conditions. He had heard stories of the Apache people living in these lands, skilled in tracking, hunting, and surviving where settlers struggled. Could she be one of them? For a long moment, they studied each other silently. John did not move quickly. He knew that sudden actions could provoke danger. The woman did not scream or cry. She simply assessed him with careful eyes. John realized that she could be dangerous if angered or frightened, but also that she had been caught not by chance but by circumstance. He felt a strange mix of admiration and responsibility. This was no ordinary encounter. It was the kind of moment that could change a man's life. He spoke softly, trying words he hoped she might understand. She shook her head, not in confusion but in defiance. Communication was limited, yet a silent understanding began to form. John fed her some dried meat, and she accepted it carefully, keeping her distance but observing him closely. There was trust building slowly, cautiously, in the space between them. John felt a mixture of curiosity and respect. He had always been self-reliant, but now he was reminded of how much he did not know, how much he had yet to learn from the land and its people. The morning stretched into afternoon, and John realized he needed to decide what to do next. The woman was clearly resilient, capable, and used to living in these harsh lands. He could not simply leave her here, and he could not yet trust her fully to walk freely. He set up a secure place near his camp, giving her water and food, and tried again to communicate. She responded with gestures, pointing to the nearby hills, showing him how to find water in hidden places, how to identify edible plants. John watched closely, absorbing every lesson, realizing that even someone captured against their will could teach profound truths. Days passed, and John began to notice more than just her survival skills. There was a wisdom in how she moved through the land, a patience and understanding that he had never experienced in other humans. She could read the tracks of animals, the movement of the wind, the signs of predators. John started to see the desert not just as a place to live and work, but as a living, breathing world with rules and messages hidden in its every stone and tree. Despite the unusual circumstances, a subtle connection began to grow between them. John had spent years alone, thinking of the land only in terms of cattle, fences, and survival. Now, through her, he began to see a deeper rhythm, a life he had never known. The woman's presence challenged him, inspired him, and unsettled him all at once. He began to question his own assumptions about people, culture, and the ways of the world. By the end of the week, John realized that this hunting trip, meant to provide food and solitude, had changed into something far more significant. He had not just captured a woman. He had encountered a living connection to a culture, a way of thinking, and a set of skills that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about life on the frontier. The desert, which had once felt empty, now seemed full of lessons, stories, and unseen paths. John went to bed that night under the stars, reflecting on the unexpected turn his life had taken. The wind whispered through the rocks and trees, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and for the first time in years, he felt a mixture of anticipation, humility, and wonder. He did not yet know how this encounter would unfold, but he sensed that his life, and the fate of his ranch, his heart, and his understanding of the land, was about to be changed forever. John McAllister could not stop thinking about the young Apache woman he had captured. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, quiet, strong, and clever beyond his expectations. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, every glance calculated. He began to realize that he was not simply dealing with a frightened traveler or a weak opponent. She was someone who had survived the harshest conditions of the desert, someone who understood the land in ways he never could, and someone whose presence was starting to change the rhythm of his days. At first, he approached her with caution. He did not want to frighten her, yet he needed to ensure she remained safe and that neither of them got hurt. The early days were tense. She would not speak in English, and John knew only a few words in her language, which he had picked up from travelers and traders. Communication was slow and awkward, often relying on gestures and simple drawings in the dirt. Still, there was a mutual understanding that developed over time, a careful patience that slowly built trust between them. John named her Little Spirit in his mind because of her calm presence and keen instincts, though he did not yet know her real name. She had deep, dark eyes that seemed to observe everything at once, and her hair was braided neatly, showing that she took care of herself even under difficult conditions. Despite being caught in his trap, she did not plead or beg. She simply watched him, alert and unyielding. John realized that this woman had been taught resilience, patience, and careful observation from a very young age. Days turned into weeks, and John noticed how resourceful she truly was. She taught him small but important skills, starting with survival basics. When he followed her to the creek, she pointed out hidden water sources he had never seen, small springs beneath rocky outcrops that were invisible unless you knew what to look for. She showed him which plants were safe to eat, which herbs could soothe a scratch or a burn, and how to identify animal tracks with remarkable precision. John had always thought he was skilled at tracking and hunting, but with her guidance, he discovered he had only scratched the surface of what the desert could teach. One morning, she led him to a patch of desert that he had always avoided. The rocks were sharp, the cacti thick, and the sun beat down mercilessly. Yet she moved through it gracefully, stepping lightly, pausing to examine the ground and pointing out signs that an animal had passed there the night before. John tried to follow her example, but he stumbled over rocks, scratched his arms on cactus needles, and realized how much he had underestimated the land he thought he knew so well. He felt a mixture of frustration and admiration. This woman, captured in his trap only weeks ago, was now his teacher. Beyond survival, she began to share stories of her people. Though John could not understand every word, her gestures and expressions conveyed lessons about courage, loyalty, and community. She spoke of her family, her home, and the hardships faced by her people at the hands of settlers and soldiers. John listened carefully, absorbing the meaning even when he did not understand the words. He began to see the world differently, not just as a place to live and work, but as a space full of life, history, and unseen struggles. John noticed how much he relied on her wisdom. In the mornings, he followed her guidance for tracking deer and rabbits. In the afternoons, she showed him how to read the weather signs, how to tell the direction of the wind, and how to move quietly so as not to scare animals away. Even the simplest things, like finding shade during the hottest parts of the day or identifying edible berries, became lessons in patience and observation. He realized that survival was more than just strength or skill. It required respect for the land and the creatures that lived on it. Despite the tension of their initial encounter, a quiet bond began to grow. John had spent years alone, speaking only to Dusty, his horse, and the occasional traveler or trader. Now he found himself anticipating her presence, watching her work, and feeling a strange sense of comfort in her calm demeanor. He noticed little things, the way she smiled faintly when he followed her instructions correctly, or how she paused to examine a plant before showing him its use. These small moments, simple as they were, began to soften the walls he had built around himself. Life in the desert, once monotonous and predictable, had become unpredictable and exciting. John began to realize that he had underestimated both the land and the people who had lived there long before settlers arrived. The young Apache woman's knowledge was not only practical, it carried a deeper wisdom about life, patience, and understanding the world around him. He had thought he knew survival, but he now saw it as a lifelong learning process, one that could not be mastered alone. Over time, she began to respond more to him, though still cautiously. She learned a few words in English, enough to ask for water or point out directions. John learned more of her language, using gestures, drawings, and repeated phrases. Their communication remained imperfect, but it was enough to share small ideas, teach each other, and build trust. John was amazed at how much could be conveyed without a shared language, how much could be learned through observation, patience, and mutual respect. One afternoon, while they were near a shallow canyon, a sudden movement startled John. A coyote had been following them, likely hunting for food. He raised his rifle instinctively, but she stopped him with a firm gesture, pointing to the coyote's tracks and signaling him to wait. She then quietly stepped forward, tossing a small piece of dried meat to distract the animal. The coyote approached, took the meat, and disappeared. John was astonished. She had solved a dangerous situation without force, using intelligence and careful observation. He realized that strength was not always about rifles or muscles. It could be about knowledge, timing, and understanding nature. As the days passed, John also began to reflect on his own character. He realized that he had been rigid, stubborn, and often judgmental about people and life on the frontier. This woman, caught by chance in his trap, had become a mirror, showing him the limitations of his knowledge and the narrowness of his previous worldview. Her presence challenged him to think differently, to question his assumptions, and to embrace patience and humility. By the end of the second week, John felt a profound change in himself. The desert, which had once seemed empty and harsh, now seemed alive with lessons, possibilities, and hidden truths. He looked at the young woman and realized that she had become more than a prisoner in his care. She had become a teacher, a guide, and an inspiration. Her strength, courage, and wisdom had begun to shape his life in ways he had never imagined. Evenings were the most reflective moments. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the desert in gold and red, John would sit quietly near the fire, watching her as she moved gracefully, preparing food or tending to small tasks. He felt a sense of peace he had not known in years, a calm that came from the knowledge that he was learning, growing, and connecting with someone in a meaningful way. It was a quiet revolution in his life, one that he would carry with him long after their paths might separate. The young woman, too, seemed to recognize the change. Though she remained reserved and careful, her gestures suggested a cautious trust. She would sometimes point out the best paths through the hills, share small survival tips, or even allow John to attempt a skill she was teaching him. Their days became a rhythm of mutual learning, respect, and careful understanding. John realized that his hunting trip, meant to secure food and solitude, had turned into a journey of discovery, of knowledge, patience, and humanity. He had captured someone, yes, but he had also been captured in a way, captured by the wisdom, courage, and spirit of a woman who had changed the way he saw the world. The encounter was no longer about the hunt. It was about learning, growing, and understanding life in ways he had never imagined. By the end of the third week, John began to think about the future differently. He wondered what would happen when she returned to her people, how he would carry forward the lessons she had taught him, and how his life on the ranch would be shaped by this encounter. He realized that this was no ordinary story of survival. It was a turning point, a moment that would define the rest of his life in ways he could not yet fully see. The desert wind whispered through the hills, carrying the scents of sage and earth, and John felt a deep sense of connection, not just to the land, but to the lessons it held, to the woman who had taught him so much, and to the possibility that life could be richer, fuller, and more meaningful than he had ever imagined. He knew, deep in his heart, that nothing would ever be the same. The days turned into weeks, and John McAllister found himself changing in ways he had never expected. The young Apache woman, whose name he had finally learned was Tayanita, had become more than just a captive. She had become a guide, a teacher, and a mirror that reflected the man he could be. Every morning, as the desert sun rose and painted the hills in soft gold, John woke with a sense of purpose he had not known in years. Survival alone was no longer enough. Now, he wanted to learn, understand, and grow. Tayanita moved through the desert with quiet confidence. She taught John how to track animals not just by sight, but by subtle signs: the crushed grass, the direction of a fallen leaf, or the faint scent carried on the wind. John had always thought he was a good tracker, but with her guidance, he realized how much he had overlooked. She showed him how to follow deer for hours without being seen, how to recognize the difference between fresh and old tracks, and how to predict the movement of animals based on the position of the sun and the patterns of the wind. John was amazed at her knowledge. It was not just about survival. Tayanita also taught John how to read the desert itself, how to listen to it. She would pause at a certain rock, point to the patterns of shadows, and explain in gestures how the earth could speak if one paid attention. John listened, fascinated. The desert, once a place of simple work and isolation, now seemed alive with hidden signs and messages. He began to see the land not as something to be conquered or used, but as a living world that demanded respect and attention. One afternoon, Tayanita led John to a canyon he had never dared to explore. The rocks were jagged, and the heat from the sun was intense, but she moved with effortless grace, showing him small crevices where water collected after the morning dew. She showed him how to find edible plants, pointing out leaves that could be eaten raw or boiled, and herbs that could soothe burns or cuts. John followed her instructions carefully, amazed at the subtle details he had never noticed before. As they worked together, John began to reflect on his own life. He had spent years thinking of the desert as something to survive in, as a harsh place that tested his strength. But now he realized it was also a teacher. Every stone, every plant, every shadow carried lessons. And Tayanita had taught him the most important lesson of all: patience. To move through life with respect, to observe carefully before acting, and to understand that every action had a consequence. The bond between them deepened slowly. Tayanita, who had once been silent and reserved, began to trust John enough to share small pieces of her life. She drew pictures in the dirt to tell stories of her childhood, of the people she loved, and of the land she had grown up in. John watched closely, absorbing not just the stories, but the meaning behind them. He learned about her family, her tribe, and the hardships they had endured. He began to see the world from a perspective he had never considered, understanding the strength it took to survive in ways that were not just physical, but emotional and spiritual. Despite the growing trust, there were moments of tension. John sometimes felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He knew that keeping Tayanita with him could bring danger. Settlers passing through the area might see her as a captive to be traded, while scouts from her tribe could arrive at any moment, seeking her release. John had to balance caution with respect, always thinking carefully about every decision. Tayanita, aware of these dangers, guided him subtly. Her gestures showed him safe paths, hidden shelters, and places where they could avoid being seen. Through this, John began to understand the depth of her knowledge and the wisdom of her instincts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, John and Tayanita sat quietly by the fire. She pointed to the stars, drawing simple patterns in the dirt. John realized she was teaching him how to read the sky, how to use the stars to navigate when no landmarks were visible. It was a skill he had never considered necessary, but now he understood its importance. The desert was vast and often unforgiving, and knowledge like this could mean the difference between life and death. Their days became a rhythm of learning, survival, and mutual respect. John taught Tayanita small skills she had not learned, like repairing a fence or maintaining a simple trap. while she taught him the subtleties of the desert. Each day brought new challenges: a sudden storm, a difficult climb, or a rare sighting of a wild animal. But together, they faced them with patience and cooperation. John found himself looking forward to these challenges, not as threats, but as opportunities to learn and grow. Through it all, John noticed a change within himself. He had been a solitary man, used to relying only on his strength and skills. But Tayanita had shown him that wisdom, observation, and respect could be just as powerful as brute force. He began to see his own faults more clearly, his impatience, his stubbornness, and his narrow view of the world. And with each day, he worked to change, to become a man who could live in harmony with the land and with others, rather than simply trying to survive it. One morning, they came across a wounded deer. John instinctively wanted to act quickly, but Tayanita stopped him, gesturing for patience. They observed the animal carefully, noting its breathing, its movements, and the tracks leading to it. Together, they devised a plan to help it, using the skills she had taught him. The experience taught John more than just survival. It taught him empathy and responsibility. He realized that the land and its creatures were not just resources, but living beings deserving care and respect. As the weeks passed, John also began to reflect on the deeper lessons of trust and friendship. Tayanita had been captured against her will, yet she had chosen to share her knowledge, to teach him, and to guide him. Her courage and generosity touched him deeply. He realized that true strength came not from domination or control, but from understanding, cooperation, and respect. He felt a growing admiration for her, a sense of connection that went beyond words or simple gestures. At night, John would often sit quietly by the fire, watching Tayanita move with calm efficiency. He noticed the small details, the way she adjusted her clothing to stay comfortable in the heat, how she arranged firewood to burn efficiently, and how she prepared meals with care. Each action was purposeful and thoughtful, reflecting a life lived in harmony with nature. John felt humbled by her presence, realizing that he had much to learn, not just about survival, but about living fully and wisely. Despite the harshness of the desert, John began to feel a sense of peace he had never known. The land, which had once seemed lonely and unforgiving, now felt alive with lessons and possibilities. And at the center of it all was Tayanita, guiding him, teaching him, and inspiring him to become more than he had ever imagined. He began to see the desert not as a place to conquer, but as a home to understand, respect, and cherish. One day, as they walked along a narrow ridge, John asked, through gestures and simple words, about her family. Tayanita hesitated, then drew images in the dirt. He learned that she had grown up in a close-knit community, that family and loyalty were everything, and that her people had faced hardships he could scarcely imagine. He felt a deep respect for her resilience, for the strength it took to survive and maintain dignity in a world that often threatened both. By the end of the third part of their journey, John realized that his life had been forever changed. The woman he had captured by accident had become the teacher he never knew he needed. She had shown him skills, lessons, and perspectives that would stay with him for a lifetime. More importantly, she had taught him humility, patience, and the importance of seeing the world through the eyes of others. John began to understand that his hunting trip, intended to provide food and solitude, had turned into a journey of discovery. He had found not just a guide, but a companion in learning, someone who challenged him, inspired him, and transformed the way he lived. The desert, which had once been a place of mere survival, now held meaning, purpose, and life lessons that he would carry forever. The sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the desert floor. John sat by the fire, reflecting on the weeks that had passed. He knew that his encounter with Tayanita was more than a chance event. It was a turning point. She had changed him in ways he could not yet fully understand, and he knew that whatever the future held, He would never see the world the same way again. Life on the desert had grown into a quiet rhythm for John McAllister and Tayanita, yet with every passing day, the tension in the air grew heavier. John knew that keeping Tayanita with him, even for her own safety and for his learning, carried serious risks. The frontier was unpredictable. Travelers and settlers passed through, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, and some with intentions that were dangerous. And then there were the scouts from Tayanita's people. John had no way of knowing if they were searching for her, or how they might react to a stranger who had captured her, even if it had been accidental. One morning, John noticed signs that unsettled him deeply. Fresh footprints, too large to belong to Tayanita, crossed the ridge near his camp. He sensed movement in the distance, shadows among the rocks that did not match the usual patterns of deer or coyotes. He whispered to Tayanita, pointing to the tracks and gesturing caution. She watched quietly, her expression unreadable but alert. She seemed to understand the danger without words, her sharp instincts guiding them both. As the day wore on, they took careful steps to avoid detection. Tayanita led John through hidden paths, small gullies and narrow ridges that he had never noticed before. She pointed to small marks in the dirt, the subtle bending of grass, and the direction of wind-blown leaves, all signs that danger could be near. John realized that he had never truly understood the desert's language until now. Every rock, every shadow, every shift in the wind carried meaning, and Tayanita had trained him to see it. But danger was not only in the wilderness. Word had spread among nearby settlers that John had a captured Apache woman. Some saw it as an opportunity to demand payment for her release, while others looked on with suspicion, thinking John might have acted unjustly. Letters had arrived at the local trading post, and rumors traveled faster than any horse. John knew he could no longer ignore the potential consequences. Keeping Tayanita meant risking his reputation, his safety, and perhaps even his life. That evening, they faced their first direct threat. A small group of men approached the edge of the canyon where John had set up camp. They were armed and cautious, clearly expecting resistance. John quickly signaled Tayanita to hide among the rocks. She moved silently, almost blending into the desert itself. John raised his hands, stepping forward to meet the men with words of calm authority. They demanded that he surrender the woman, claiming she belonged to them or that he must be punished for taking her. John stood firm, feeling the weight of every lesson Tayanita had taught him. He spoke carefully, explaining that he had not harmed her and that she had been caught accidentally. His words were slow and deliberate, chosen to calm the situation. The men hesitated, unsure whether to trust him. Tayanita, hidden but watching, gave him a small gesture, a tilt of her head, a calm, confident look that seemed to strengthen his resolve. He realized that she had taught him more than survival. She had taught him courage, patience, and how to face challenges without fear. The confrontation ended without violence, but John knew it was only a temporary relief. He and Tayanita retreated deeper into the hills, moving cautiously and using every skill she had taught him. They found hidden shelters beneath rocky overhangs and small caves, places where they could rest safely and avoid detection. Each day was a delicate balance between survival, learning, and protecting each other from the dangers of the world around them. As they navigated the desert together, John faced another challenge: his own conscience. Keeping Tayanita had become morally complex. He had initially captured her by accident, but now he realized that holding her against her will, even with good intentions, was wrong. Yet letting her go could mean exposing her to danger from others who might not be as careful or understanding. He struggled to reconcile his growing respect and affection for her with the knowledge that freedom, not captivity, was her right. Tayanita, ever perceptive, seemed to sense his inner turmoil. She communicated through gestures and expressions, showing him that she understood his intentions. yet gently reminding him that trust and respect were more important than control. John began to see that true protection did not come from holding someone captive, but from empowering them to make their own choices while offering guidance and support. Her lessons extended beyond survival in the desert. They were lessons in life, morality, and humanity. One day, while resting near a hidden stream, they were confronted by another danger. A group of bandits, hoping to steal supplies or exact revenge, appeared along the ridge above them. John's heart raced, but Anita remained calm. She signaled him to wait, showing him a small path hidden by brush and rocks that could lead them to safety. John followed her quietly, careful not to alert the bandits. Together, they slipped through the shadows, moving with the precision and patience of people who truly understood the land. The escape was tense, and John felt adrenaline coursing through his veins. Yet it also brought clarity. He realized that the lessons Anita had taught him, the quiet observation, the respect for nature, the patience and the careful thinking, were more valuable than any rifle or trap. In moments of danger, those skills became not just survival tools, but guides for life itself. He had learned to see the world differently, to move through it with awareness, and to trust both his instincts and the wisdom of others. After that encounter, John made a decision that would change everything. He realized that he could no longer think of Anita as someone to be kept for his own purposes. She was not property, nor could she be treated as a prize for his skill or caution. She was a person with knowledge, strength, and dignity. He knew he had to give her the choice of freedom, even if it meant risking his own safety and comfort. The following days were filled with careful planning. John and Anita discussed, through gestures and simple words, the paths she could take to return to her people safely. He offered guidance, sharing knowledge of the land and the safest routes, while she assessed the paths herself. Together, they navigated dangerous terrain, avoiding both natural hazards and the people who might seek to harm or capture her. It was a delicate dance of trust, cooperation, and careful decision-making. Finally, the day came when Anita was ready to leave. John felt a mix of pride, sorrow, and gratitude. He had learned so much from her, and she had transformed his understanding of the world. Yet he knew that freedom was more important than his attachment or desire to keep her close. They stood at the edge of a canyon, the sun setting behind distant hills, and shared a final look of understanding. No words were necessary. The bond they had formed spoke volumes. As Anita moved away, John felt a profound sense of change within himself. The desert, once a place of survival and solitude, had become a landscape of lessons and growth. He realized that encounters like this were rare, moments that could alter the course of a life forever. The courage, wisdom, and spirit of one person had reshaped him, teaching him lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. In the days that followed, John returned to his ranch, but he was no longer the same man who had set out on a simple hunting trip. He applied the lessons Anita had taught him: patience, respect for nature, careful observation, and moral courage to his daily life. He treated the land with reverence, cared for his animals with greater thoughtfulness, and approached the people around him with newfound understanding and empathy. Even years later, John would remember Anita not just as the Apache woman he had captured, but as the person who had changed his life. Her teachings were embedded in his actions, his choices, and his understanding of the world. He realized that her influence extended far beyond the desert, shaping the man he had become and the life he would lead from that day forward. The encounter had been brief, dangerous, and full of uncertainty, yet it left a lasting impact. John had faced moral dilemmas, threats from both nature and people, and the challenges of survival, but through it all, he had learned the true meaning of courage, respect, and freedom. Anita had shown him that strength was not measured by force or control, but by wisdom, patience, and the ability to trust and empower others. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the hills in shades of gold and orange, John often found himself looking toward the horizon, remembering the lessons, the guidance, and the presence of Tayanita. She had entered his life unexpectedly, challenged him profoundly, and departed as quietly as she had come, leaving a legacy of knowledge and transformation. And in that knowledge, John found a sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the world, and a renewed appreciation for the life he had been given. After Tayanita had left, John McAllister returned to his ranch, but he was no longer the same man who had set out on that hunting trip. The desert, which had once seemed harsh, empty, and unyielding, now appeared alive with lessons he could carry into every aspect of his life. He noticed the way the wind shaped the sand, the careful tracks left by animals, and the rhythm of the sun across the hills. Each day reminded him of the time he had spent with Tayanita, learning not just to survive, but to understand, respect, and appreciate the land and its secrets. Life on the ranch took on a new purpose. John began to care for his cattle and crops with more thought and patience. He found ways to work with the land rather than against it. Simple tasks, like repairing fences or managing water for the fields, were no longer chores done out of necessity. They became exercises in observation and care. John remembered how Tayanita had shown him to read the land, to notice what was hidden, and to respect every living thing. Even Dusty, his old horse, seemed to sense the change in John. The trust and calm that had grown between man and horse now reflected the lessons he had learned from Tayanita about patience and gentleness. John also began to interact differently with people. Before, he had been wary and distant, preferring solitude to the company of others. Now he approached settlers, traders, and neighbors with a new sense of understanding. He listened more than he spoke and sought to understand the challenges others faced. The kindness and respect he had learned from Tayanita's guidance extended beyond the desert to the people around him. Slowly, John built relationships that were based on mutual trust, honesty, and consideration. But the lessons of Tayanita were not only practical. She had taught him about courage, integrity, and morality. He often reflected on the difficult choices he had faced while keeping her safe. Letting her go had been one of the hardest decisions of his life, yet it was the right one. It had shown him that true strength lay in respecting freedom and trust rather than asserting control. John realized that these lessons applied to everything: his relationships, his work, and his understanding of the world. He began to live with a sense of honor and fairness that earned him the respect of both settlers and local native communities. The desert, which had once been a place of survival, had become a teacher, and Tayanita had been the guide who unlocked its lessons. John often returned to the areas where they had spent time together: the small creek where she had shown him hidden water, the ridges where they had tracked deer, and the narrow paths she had used to navigate safely through dangerous terrain. These places became sacred to him, not because of their beauty, but because of the transformation he had experienced there. Every rock, tree, and shadow reminded him of patience, wisdom, and the importance of seeing the world beyond his own perspective. John also kept a journal, something he had never done before. He wrote down the lessons he had learned from Tayanita, both practical and spiritual. He sketched the desert landscapes, drew the patterns of animal tracks, and recorded the methods she had used to survive and thrive. Most importantly, he documented her wisdom, her teachings about courage, respect, and the deeper understanding of life. In doing so, he created a lasting record of their time together, a way to honor her influence and ensure that the knowledge she had shared would not be forgotten. Occasionally, John received news of Tayanita's people. Traders and travelers spoke of a woman matching her description, moving safely through the land, sharing knowledge with her own community. John felt a deep sense of relief and pride. He had worried for her safety after letting her go, but it became clear that she had returned home without harm. Knowing that she was thriving reinforced his belief in the importance of freedom, respect, and trust. As years passed, John's life continued to reflect the lessons he had learned. The ranch prospered under his care, but more importantly, he had become a man of wisdom and integrity. Settlers sought his advice, not only for farming and survival skills, but also for guidance in handling conflicts and understanding the land. Local native communities respected him because he treated their people and traditions with fairness and humility. John had become a bridge between worlds, a man who understood the value of learning from others rather than imposing his will. Even in his personal life, John felt the change deeply. Loneliness, which had once been a constant companion, had been replaced with a sense of purpose and fulfillment. He found joy in simple moments: the movement of animals across the hills, the quiet of the desert at dawn, and the warmth of Dusty nuzzling his hand. These were the small things Tayanita had taught him to notice, to appreciate, and to respect. Life, he realized, was not just about survival or work. It was about understanding, connection, and awareness. John never forgot Tayanita. Though she had returned to her people, her influence remained a constant in his life. He often spoke of her to travelers and neighbors, sharing her wisdom, the skills she had taught him, and the courage she had shown. Yet he did so with humility, never claiming credit, always acknowledging that she had changed his life and his understanding of the world. To John, Tayanita was more than a teacher. She was a guiding spirit whose lessons continued to shape him every day. In the quiet moments of his life, John would often walk alone along the desert ridges where they had hunted, tracked, and explored. He remembered the way she had moved through the land with effortless grace, the way she had taught him to observe, and the small gestures that carried profound meaning. He reflected on how much he had grown, not only in skill, but in character, empathy, and understanding. The transformation was complete. John was no longer just a rancher. He was a man who had learned to live fully, wisely, and with respect for the world around him. John also realized that the desert itself had become a part of him. He could read its subtle signs, predict changes in weather, and find hidden resources with ease. These skills were valuable for survival, but they were also a reflection of a deeper connection to the land that he had never known before meeting Tayanita. The desert had been a teacher, Tayanita its guide, and John had been transformed not just by circumstance, but by insight, humility, and courage. As he grew older, John shared these lessons with the next generation. He welcomed young ranch hands and travelers, teaching them the skills and wisdom that Tayanita had passed to him. He emphasized patience, observation, respect for the land, and the importance of learning from others. Many listened, amazed at the depth of his knowledge and the thoughtfulness of his guidance. John knew that these teachings would live on, carrying a part of Tayanita's spirit into the future. Though Tayanita had left the desert, John felt her presence constantly. The lessons she had taught were woven into every action, decision, and observation. Her influence had shaped not only his survival, but the very way he understood life. He knew that meeting her had not been an accident. It had been a turning point, a moment that changed his fate forever. The solitary rancher who had once sought only food and shelter had become a man of wisdom, compassion, and understanding. In the evenings, John would often sit by the fire, looking at the stars that Tayanita had once pointed out. He thought of the paths they had walked, the lessons learned, and the trust they had shared. The memory of her guidance brought him peace, inspiration, and a sense of purpose. He knew that his life would always carry her influence, shaping him in ways both seen and unseen. John McAllister lived the rest of his life as a man changed by a single encounter in the desert. The hunting trip that had begun as a search for food had become a journey of learning, growth, and transformation. He understood that the people we meet and the lessons they teach can alter the course of our lives in profound ways. Tayanita had done just that. She had changed his life, his character, and his fate forever. Even after many years, John often returned to the hills, the creek, and the hidden paths where they had spent time together. He felt gratitude every day for her wisdom, her courage, and the gift of seeing the world differently. The lessons of patience, respect, and understanding stayed with him, guiding his actions, shaping his decisions, and enriching every aspect of his life. In the end, John realized that the true treasure of that hunting trip was not the game he sought, but the knowledge, insight, and friendship he had gained. Tayanita had taught him lessons that could not be measured in gold, furs, or cattle. She had opened his eyes to the deeper truths of life, shown him the strength of empathy, and inspired him to live fully, wisely, and with an open heart. And so, the rancher who had once walked the desert alone carried forward a legacy of learning and transformation. The encounter with Tayanita was a story he would carry forever, a story of courage, wisdom, trust, and the profound power of human connection. Her presence had changed his fate, and her lessons continued to guide him long after she had disappeared into the hills, leaving behind a lasting influence that would shape his life forever.